Good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is Victoria Beal with the Ohio LTAP Center, and I am very pleased today to be hosting a webinar for you on the topic of knowledge management. I'm going to let Joseph explain a little further about the actual topic itself, but I wanted to give you a couple quick housekeeping items before the presentation started. The first housekeeping item I want to mention is we do have a copy of all of the presentations and a copy of the bios that should be currently up on your screen in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel. So we would encourage you to download those sometime during the presentation, but if you can't get it to work, don't despair, because we will also send a follow-up email with hopefully a link to a recording of this webinar, along with links to those handouts as well. The other item I wanted to mention is that we will be taking questions all throughout the webinar today, and those questions are going to be collected up and then will be addressed at the end in a panel fashion. But please use the question box in the GoToWebinar software to send questions in. And as you send them in, I'll be sending them over to Joseph so he can have those ready to go for the Q&A portion. So Joseph, are you ready?
I am ready.
Thanks.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. This is, and we welcome you to our webinar today. This webinar is a repeat of the Information and Knowledge Management Committee session that was held at the TRB annual meeting in January. We have 3 presentations with 4 speakers, and we anticipate about an hour with questions at the end of the presentations. You have in front of you the bios of the 4 speakers, and I'm not going to read them verbatim, but I'll just give you a quick overview. Not in any particular order. First is Frances Harrison. She's the founding partner and chief technical officer at Spy Pond Partners, and she has over 40 years of experience in consulting to federal, state, and local transportation agencies in the areas of knowledge management, data, information management, asset transportation decision support tools, and performance management. She's also serves as the co-chair of the TRB Information and Knowledge Management Committee, and she was the former chair of the prior committee before the reorg. Also today we have Lynn Randolph. She's a senior program manager at the Southwest Research Institute, a not-for-profit research and development organization. Lynn has over 23 years of experience in ITS, Intelligent Information Systems, data analytics, and systems engineering. She's also worked with numerous departments of transportation to incorporate technology advancements to improve safety and mobility. She's a PMP with the Project Management Institute, and was also a principal investigator for TRB NCHRP 23-02. John Wolfe is a managing director of Global Dynamic Group, a consulting firm helping public and private sector transportation clients to realize the value of the next industrial revolution by utilizing technology to manage knowledge and information as a strategic asset. He was also recently a senior VP of digital strategy at Dentsu Aegis Network in both New York and Lucky Him, Rome, Italy. He's also an elected official. John has hands-on experience at all levels of government and served in the Bush and Clinton administrations. And finally, Katie Crabb is working with the District of Columbia Department of Transportation. She started as an intern and is now working her way up through the organization. She founded the current library. She served as the agency as both a traditional librarian and also an information specialist. And she does work in several areas ranging from historical archiving to research, helping with the intern program administration and knowledge management. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first session. Frances, you are keyed up and ready to go, and I'm going to let each speaker announce the topic of their discussion, and you have about 15 minutes each. So welcome, everybody.
Hi, everybody. I am going to talk about an NCHRP project called Mapping the Common Interests of AASHTO Committees. This is NCHRP project 20-24, parentheses 131. It's a project that's been going on for a while. It's had two phases of work. One of the phases has been completed, and I'm just going to give you a little overview of the project. I'm going to talk about kind of how we did, what the objectives were, how we did what we did, go over some of the products and how they're intended to be used, and a sneak preview of the second phase of the project that's currently ongoing. So the purpose of the project was to look at the different committees that American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, or AASHTO, has. They've got over 30 different technical committees. And even though the scope of each committee is pretty well defined, inevitably there's overlaps in interests across these committees. So this project was initiated by the Knowledge Management Committee at AASHTO, and there was interest in a methodology and an approach to figuring out what the committees have in common, and then using that information to suggest ways in which the committees should be sharing information and collaborating with each other. As Victoria mentioned, all of the slides will be posted, and if you go to, if you download this presentation and you go down to the bottom of this slide, you can see all of the phase 1 products of this research if you're interested in learning more. So for those of you who aren't familiar with AASHTO, this is a picture of the current committee structure. There's a board of directors at the top. And then to the left is the Transportation Policy Forum with a set of modal councils and a special committee on freight that's multimodal. And so these are the bodies that do a lot of work on topics specific to a particular mode. And then there are a bunch of committees that are focused around kind of program delivery and operations topics, and committees focused on administrative type functions. That's where the Knowledge Management Committee sits, but that's where Human Resources, Civil Rights, Audit, and then we have the cross-discipline committees, things like safety, data management, funding and finance, performance. What we did initially in this project was use a kind of a text mining and machine learning process to look at the documents of each committee, and those include charters that describe what the scopes were, the strategic plans, which are updated every few years, action plans, which are updated every year and say what activities the committee is planning, but also web pages. And based on just manually reviewing those, we created a framework of topics, kind of bigger bucket categories or facets for organizing what the categories are. And then we use text analysis to look at kind of word frequency and clusters to identify topics that might be in common across the committees. And then we kind of pasted those two things together, did some manual work to refine these topics. And so at that point, we had kind of a set of categories with some specific topics that were common to multiple committees. We had various AASHTO committee liaisons validate those, and that then led to kind of some final products. One of the things that we did early on that was very helpful was to just prepare a couple-page summary on each committee. And those summaries identify the purpose, the subgroups that the committee has, the substantive topics that they're interested in, what kinds of collaborations were evident in their current strategic and action plans, related technical service programs and centers of excellence, and external partners and stakeholders, and any kind of links that they have to committee pages, etc. These, we think, are very useful resources for existing committee members, especially ones who are new, that are really just trying to find out what committees do what and what their interests are. So this is kind of one piece of trying to facilitate collaboration. The framework was a big part of the phase 1 product, and the framework for organizing common interest is a 3-level framework. There's 6 high-level framework categories. So for example, one is related to modes and users that committees are interested in. And then under that, there's elements. Freight transportation would be an example of a sub-element of the modes and users category. And then the bottom one are the topics of interest themselves. So in this example, truck parking would be kind of under the freight transportation category. This is a snapshot of the framework. You can see the 6 boxes representing those high-level categories, and then each of the bulleted items are the sub-items of each category under which the common interest, the specific common interest topics are organized. We created this framework because there were so many topics of interest that just having a big unorganized laundry list would be really difficult to use. And also this provides some stability as topics come and go. This provides kind of the scaffolding within which to understand some of the common interests. And they just reflect the ways, the different ways that committees have interests in common. So sometimes you want to think about committees that have shared interest in, say, bridges and structures. So there's a design committee that has specific design interest related to bridges and structures, and then there's a bridges and structures committee on its own that's interested in that mode, for example. This is just a visual picture of a histogram of the 76 common interests that were identified and how many of the 30 committees shared that interest. So you can see that there's a relatively small number of topics that are shared by kind of 6 or more committees. There's a couple interests that gets up to kind of the high teens, but then there's a very long tail of topics that are shared by maybe 2 or 3 committees. Here's a visualization, for example, of one of the most popular common interests, which is use of drones. So here's the schematic of that AASHTO committee structure I showed earlier, and all of the committees highlighted in green that are interested in drones. The other kind of top interests were connected and automated vehicles. There were 15 committees interested in that topic, and workforce development and succession planning. There were 17 committees with interest in workforce, many of which were related to how do we kind of develop and train the workforce of the future to meet our particular domain's needs. Here's an example of one of the products, which is the spreadsheet containing each of the framework categories and the underlying subtopics and the common interests that were identified for those framework areas. The other things that we did was based on our text analysis to identify keywords or related terms because there's always evolution in terminology. And so we're thinking at some point in the future, this could be helpful to facilitate search. We also developed just some really simple spreadsheet tools that can be used by committee leads or liaisons to update their common interests periodically. We don't think they change that often, but maybe every few years to review the list, add new topics, eliminate existing topics. So that tool is available. And then one of the products that we think is probably most valuable from this effort is a visualization tool. This helps you kind of navigate the different committee interests. I'm going to try to show it and see if it works on this webinar. So this is kind of a view of the committees by that organizing structure I showed. And so you click which kind of cluster of committees you're interested in. This is the enterprise cross-discipline cluster. And then you can select one of the committees. So for example, data management and analytics. And then that will show the different common interests that were assigned to that committee, and the color coding references the framework element that is related to. And then you can click on one of those and see what other committees are also interested in that. So if you're a member of an AASHTO committee and you're looking for collaboration opportunities, you can use this tool to see who else should you be coordinating with or communicating with. There's also a view by interest categories. So if you're looking at, say, innovations or emergent practices, you can pick one of those and you can see which committees had that interest as well. And that link also is live, and feel free to use it to explore the results of this effort. So how will this be used? Part of what we're anticipating is that these tools could be used in multiple ways. One, during the process of developing strategic plans and action plans to identify potential collaborators. So for example, if you want to initiate a new research project or do a conference, you can see maybe other committees that you can work together with to do that. Then, event planning and research development outside of that strategic planning and action planning process that happens kind of once a year or once every 3 years, you could also use throughout the year for that. And then collaboration on development of standards, guidance, and training materials. Try to see what other committees might also have an interest in that and work together. And then also just for onboarding for new committee members or new AASHTO staff liaisons, to be able to just explore and understand who's doing what, who's interested in what. The second phase of the project, which is now underway, is doing a few things. One is to just refine the initial products. The initial ones didn't look at subcommittees under the committees, and there are a number of really important subcommittees that have very distinctive and substantive technical interests. So those were added with their own specific interests. And then there were some additional validation and annotation of the common interests. So not only do you see in the tool that a committee has a particular interest, but you have a little bit more information on what their interest is. So many committees are interested in drones, but some are more interested in kind of airspace and regulatory issues, whereas others are more interested in applications for data collection, inspection, etc. And then the second piece is to document and share a process, more of a step-by-step process for using these tools during the annual action planning process and during some of the other processes for research, development, and event planning, just so that it's super easy and clear how to use them and how to get the value out of these tools. and then to just substantively document what collaboration is occurring now, and also what are some potential areas where there might be more opportunities for collaboration and what types of actions would make sense. So that's the end of my presentation. Please put comments into the comment area, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions at the end of the webinar.
Fantastic. Thank you, Frances. Next up, I'd like to introduce Lynn Randolph of the Southwest Research Institute and John Wolfe of the Global Dynamic Group. Take it away.
Okay. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are, as the case may be. I'm Lynn. I'm going to share this presentation with John, so we're going to swap in the middle and then you'll get back to me at the end. This is a project for NCHRP 23-02, and it's about knowledge sharing and how to shape your agency policies to promote secure collaboration. So as part of this, we had a team. There were 3 of us from Southwest Research and 2 from Global Dynamic Groups, and also our program officer, David Jared, who we actually swapped from Andy Lemire, who I saw on today, so I wanted to mention him as well. And we also had a large number of panel members who were very active in helping shape this course of this project. We also interviewed some public staff people as part of the project. So a lot of thanks. It was a very global effort to do this project. So there's 4 pieces to this presentation. The first is we're going to talk about the purpose of the project and what the goals were for doing this work. And then I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about the research we performed and the analysis we did on that research to guide our approach moving forward. And then John will turn it back to me when we talk about the secure collaboration tool that we created as part of the project. So here's the project purpose. I'm not going to read it to you, but in general, it was trying to figure out how to balance the concerns between security and promoting collaboration. And the project website has more details on that, which you should be able to find on the TRB webpage. So when we think about the goals, right, it's a matter of balancing your risks versus your opportunities, as is most everything. I think about this a lot when we're in the world of COVID right now. You know, you're always balancing the risk of, you know, getting out there and getting sick with your opportunities that you're missing by not getting out there and possibly getting sick. So it's a similar dichotomy between balancing the needs for collaboration and sharing your knowledge and your data with other people, and how to protect yourselves and your data and your information from bad actors. So it's definitely about finding balance between those 2 things. And it's more apparent as we move into a, you know, totally globally connected society where everyone really needs to work together and share data in order to promote the projects that they're working on. John, I'm going to turn it over to you so you can talk about the research that we performed as part of this.
Thank you, Lynn, and hello, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. We really love this project, and one of the interesting things about it is the context of where this project lies in the intersection of communication and technology. And as Lynn referred to a moment ago, the idea of security was paramount, but also how do you unlock the opportunities that new communications and communication technologies allow for? And how do you do that in a safe and secure way? So when we looked at the literature and we looked at the current state of practice and we looked at past projects, what we really found was that this is new territory. This is new ground. It hasn't really been covered before. So we had an approach of interviewing people who are in a cross section of DOT roles because we wanted a multidisciplinary perspective. We spoke to people that meant in leadership who were thinking of strategic planning. We talked to people who were specifically in roles related to security and cybersecurity. But then particularly we wanted to speak to those who would benefit from greater collaboration and greater knowledge and data sharing to understand what are they doing now, what are the challenges they face, and what are the barriers they face. And from this, we were really able to identify a lot of things that people are trying to do, as well as the barriers that are preventing them from doing it. And that's what we've chronicled. Next slide, please. So with respect to the selected use cases, we took these practices and we came up with use cases that reflected actual circumstances. So although they were anonymized in data, we based the creation of the use cases in actual experience. And we did that because we wanted to make sure that the lessons we were drawing came from real experience, and that the lessons that we were applying and the analysis and recommendations that we made would be applicable to how people are actually trying to engage in knowledge and data sharing and communications with people external to their agencies. So what this slide now shows you is some examples of the use cases that we put together. You can see the kinds of stakeholders that in each of these use cases might have been involved in any one in particular use case. The activities were in some cases wide, in some cases limited. In some cases, there was a specific task with a known end date, and other times it was an ongoing activity. But the one thing all these things had in common was the idea that this is an example of where one or more people are engaging in sharing of data and information, or in sharing in some kind of collaboration and working towards a common purpose. So with respect to the content of the use case, we created a basic template so that our analysis would be the same throughout all of the process. And as you can see from this list, it was a pretty straightforward template at the surface level. We spoke to panel members and DOT staff and those that would be involved in these kinds of use cases to make sure that we fleshed these out in a way that reflected actual experience. Next slide, please.
So these are just examples of the workflow, the pictures that are on here. This is the one setting up a use case. So this is an example of the AASHTO committee setting up a use case and what was involved in that initial creation of a committee. And then the next one would represent the ongoing activities of a use case. I just wanted to make sure we called attention to those diagrams.
Oh no, that's a very good point. And the representations, if we might have gone through those, just maybe you could go back to that one, Lynn.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Just to give people a chance to really look at that. So this is just an example of a diagram, but if you follow it, it's meant to graphically represent actual activities. So are you involving a document in your activity? Does this involve the exchange of emails? Is there an exchange of data and knowledge? And if so, through what media? These are the kinds of things that we captured, and this is just an example of one, but these were captured graphically. But what that allowed us to do was to identify in each of these cases, what are the specific activities, what are the specific objectives, et cetera. And organizing that information, and we can go to the next slide, please. And in organizing that information, we achieved the objective of that task, which was we wanted to define what are the actual business requirements for each of the participants to be actually able to either share information or data, engage in collaborative activities, or in some cases, what were the impediments and what would need to occur in order to overcome them. So we organized them, and what we found really is that there's 4 ways to look at these things. The first are functional goals. So you might have a particular objective that you're trying to achieve that might be task-oriented, there's expected outputs. That might be the kind of activity you're engaging in, and that requires you to either collaborate with somebody or share information, et cetera. Another thing are the technical requirements. So the methodology that you might be using or the media that you might be using to actually share information may have particular characteristics and data that require collaboration or pre-agreements. For example, through what media are you going to share this information? Is it safe and secure? Is the other person authenticated? That sort of thing. A lot of the technical questions fall into this kind of category. But we also found that that's separate from the third area, which is just operational requirements. So are there documentation and guidelines in place? Are there data sharing agreements in place? These often related to technical things, but we felt these are more operational and more governance. And then finally, there's the straight up security questions. Are the tools allowable? Are the right permissions in place for the various parties to participate? Have there been policies and procedures that are being followed? Not only are they documented in the operational aspect, but are they being followed? And what is the protocol? What do you do if there's a breach? That sort of thing. So we identified, I forget the exact number, something like 42 different ones, and we analyzed them and we applied them to our use cases. And what we did is we mapped the requirements to each of the generated use cases, so that allowed us to stress test and make sure that what we've identified actually applied to these situations, and we refine them that way. Then we also refine the scenarios for each of the specific activities in the use cases to clarify where is that point of friction, where is that point of barrier that needs to be overcome. And then we considered there's going to be variations across agencies, and what are the key takeaways that we can share with agencies so this is actually helpful? And that brought us into the next phase of our research. So what we found, although we did not anticipate this, was that there are a lot of these, what we're calling requirements. And don't worry if you can't read that box on the right. That's just meant to graphically illustrate that there's just a lot of these things that each were defined as a specific requirement for data sharing or for collaboration. But in all of the use cases, a lot of these actually applied. So because almost every requirement that we identified could be seen to be relevant in every particular use case, we thought that simply providing this list would not be sufficient help to people who are trying to figure out, how do I actually expand my collaboration and information sharing capabilities? And that's because there is no one size fits all answer. You can't create guidelines that apply to any particular situation. Every situation, regardless of its similarities, at the end of the day is different and has different requirements for each and every agency, particularly since each and every agency has its own policies and procedures. And the best practices followed by one agency may not fit another agency, or they may have different requirements that don't allow them to do a particular thing. So what we realized is that in order to create guidelines that would actually be helpful, we needed something that would be more flexible, that could apply to a situation based on certain inputs. So it led us to approach our results in a slightly different way. So we found that there were clear policies and procedures in place with some parties and not in others. And we found a clear correlation between the two, that when you had, as an agency, clear collaboration requirements in place, and when you followed them, and when you had guidelines, there tended to be a greater incidence of sharing and data and information. And it was pretty clear to us that one begets the other. So the foundation to being able to share information safely and securely, being able to collaborate with other agencies safely and securely, requires that each agency have a clear sense of what its policies and procedures and guidelines are. And when there's confidence in those policies and procedures, then collaboration happens. And we found that the opposite was also true, that those that struggle the most with collaboration and those that struggle the most with being able to share information, regardless of the media, whether it was using a website, whether it was using a communication tool such as the one we're on today, that's because they didn't have that clear guidance. They didn't have those things documented. So our conclusion is, how do you help them? So we wanted to create a collaboration tool that had the flexibility built in, that could apply to an agency or an agency user's needs based on their current situation and based on the best practices and learnings that were available from our experience. And that was the tool that we created. So it required for policy makers, they could create their policies and procedures.
John, I was going to take over from here.
Oh, this is your. Lynn,
okay. So in order to have this collaboration tool, what we wanted to do is have two different types of users for it. One is you have the policymakers who need to have a place to know whether they have policies and procedures in place for the various requirements, and they want to give those guidelines to their users so that there's direction on how to collaborate and share data and knowledge. And then from a staff perspective, we want to show them how they can safely engage in the collaborative efforts and data sharing activities and know how to follow the appropriate policies and procedures. So I'm going to go quicker because Joseph came on to tell me my time was lower. So the policymakers then, there's a workflow for them that shows them how to ensure that they have those policies and procedures in place, but also have a kind of a feedback loop and review them regularly to make sure they're up to date. So for things like when COVID happened and people didn't have things in place to do work from home, you need to go back and revisit those and change your policies and procedures. And then the collaborators then can look at this tool, select the requirements for their use cases, and review the appropriate policies, procedures, and best practices, and give feedback back to the policymakers. Skip this one. This is just the content of the tool. And then the tool is an Excel document. And what it's in place for is to try to help you create these policies and procedures in a way that's usable across agencies. So we didn't want to provide some software that someone had to download. It needed to be something that was available in your intranet. So we used Excel for this. And the impact of this is you have to think about what you're doing and whether you have policies and procedures that are in place for your use case. And then this is just an example of using the tool. You would select your requirements that you have in place, and it would prompt you to add additional requirements in the attempt to make sure you knew that these may be related to ones that you have. So it turns blue as you're selecting things and processes you through all those requirements that John had talked about before. And then at the end, when you've gone through all these requirements, you are then directed to a page where it shows you the policies and procedures for the particular requirements that you selected. And those would be the policies and procedures that are put in place by your agency policymakers in the tool already. So we created this tool, we provided a summary report. This information I think is about ready to be published. So you'll have access to this on the project website. And then questions we're going to hold to the end. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lynn. Thank you, John. I encourage everybody to download the presentations. There's a lot going on there. Finally, Katie Crabb is with the District DC Department of Transportation. And Katie, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Glad to be here with you all today. I am going to discuss our Wiki project here at DDOT. Hold on one second. Okay, so DDOT's kind of new to the world of knowledge management. I'm kind of one of the only employees here, a small handful, that are kind of working on this project. So background is I'm the librarian / archivist / information manager at this agency. And the library itself has been around for about 11 years now, since I made this slide. But other efforts are kind of more in their infancy. And DDOT has over 1,000 employees, and our kind of organizational culture does not always lend itself to knowledge management and information management. So I'm trying to change that here. We have all kinds of places where we put things: SharePoint, the Wiki, which I'm going to discuss, shared drives, OneDrive. I'm sure you all know how it can be. And the kind of general information management strategies and knowledge management strategies outside the library need major improvement. It's a lot about trying to make people understand why this is important and how it will make employees' lives easier, and make it easier for the public to find things also. That's kind of the Wild West, but we have a great new CIO who's very interested in this work. So I'm excited, and the Wiki has been a stepping stone to all of that. So the wiki began around 2016, and the origin of the project was to gather our data, which is always a struggle when we have so much of it. But it kind of grew into more than that. It kind of turned into a how do we replace the DDoT intranet with a lot of internal policies and procedures, because our old one was kind of stuck in an Ask Jeeves 1995 kind of era and didn't really work all that well, and had to be updated by IT. It wasn't user friendly or accessible to kind of employees generally to just update their own stuff. And we did, I did a lot of the research, kind of figuring out what existed to use, and I'm sure it's probably changed in the past 5 years, but we looked at a few things and then eventually decided on Confluence because it was easy to use. And it is expensive, but we are lucky enough to be a local government agency has a little bit more money to spend occasionally. But proving the value of needing yet another piece of software was not an easy task. We kind of focused on how if employees are more easily able to find information, they would not waste time looking for things, which improves productivity, etc. So what counts as knowledge? The wiki focuses on institutional knowledge, that kind of gray area of information that's lost, that could be lost when someone leaves the agency if it's not documented. So there's a lot of things in the wiki, but the main things are policies and procedures for individual teams and groups across the agency. A lot of groups track their project progress. So the planners, myself and my colleagues in research, track our research projects, and also recently full text versions of all of the DDoT standards, of which there are many, are being transferred over so that people can update them in the wiki rather than passing back and forth Word documents with track changes. And what doesn't go in the wiki, DDoT studies. The DDoT studies are a little bit considered gray literature in the general definition of library science, but for DDoT, they're more, we count them more as books, so they go here in the library, in our catalog. Also historical items, which are also in the library, and more kind of general records that don't necessarily need to be kept, though there is a little bit of overlap there. Our research and library page was one of the first wiki pages to go up, and it's a pretty good example, if I do say so myself, because my colleague and I wanted to document things, should we leave and people could pick up where we left off. And it turned out to be a good thing because my colleague is leaving. So she documented all of her work on the wiki, how to do different things. So we have our past and current research projects there. We also run an intern program, so the history of that program is there. Library procedures and FAQs, how do you check out a book, how do you request a new book, that kind of thing, so that whenever I leave DDoT, the new person will not have to create the wheel. So just a kind of a few things about the wiki. Our biggest and first ally was IT, in particular our GIS team. The guy who pioneered the wiki just left the agency, but he was a great ally to kind of bringing knowledge management into the agency. And others have been our communications team, which worked with me a lot to put more things on the wiki when they were redoing our external website. So both things were easier to navigate. And our planners, our urban planners, use the wiki a ton, which I love them for. And the wiki is growing all the time. There's no rule that you have to use the wiki here to document things, which I would like to change, but that's a long process. So we kind of approach people who we think might be interested in using the wiki and who might best benefit from it and suggest that they try it out. And I kind of tutor people on how to use the wiki and help them set up their sites and everything. It's pretty easy to use, but like anything, it can be a little overwhelming if you haven't used it before. So knowledge can be harder to capture than a lot of other things, even data, which is also difficult, but knowledge is a little harder to define. So I do my best to kind of teach people the kind of things that would belong in the wiki. So some other things that are on the wiki, the policy compendium is a big one. And this is actually not just internal, it's external, it's public facing. And it contains hundreds of policies and procedures that the public would need to know. And it was mandated by our city council. And during the height of the pandemic, it used to live in SharePoint, and I transferred everything by hand over to the wiki, which was an adventure. But it made the wiki was a lot easier to update, and it wouldn't just be me doing the updates in the compendium necessarily. Other people could also do the updates, which doesn't leave me holding the bag all the time. And as I mentioned, our standards have recently been moved over. And we also have things like PowerPoint Central, different PowerPoints about our budget process, unfinished projects, that kind of thing that didn't really have anywhere else to live, but people wanted to refer to. And we have a ton of other stuff, performance management, data, the planners, the library, GIS, all kinds of stuff. And so the wiki is organized into spaces and pages, and spaces are larger and pages, it's kind of like Wikipedia in that way. So it's pretty easy to use. Everything's nested together. So for example, we have the library and research space, and then we have the different pages, the library landing page, our historical digitization page, research landing page, intern landing page with child pages beneath it. And you can also tag things or label them in Confluence's terms. And if you click on the label, everything will just pop up that's under that label. There have been some attempts on my part to kind of regulate, make a controlled vocabulary of the labels. That hasn't happened yet, but I am determined to make it happen at some point. So these are just kind of some examples. This is the standards page in the compendium. As you can kind of see, it's very basic. Again, it looks like Wikipedia, very text heavy, but you can put videos and photos and PDFs in here. It's really easy to use, really clean looking. And this is kind of the front page with the main stuff that people would be most interested in accessing. And the stickiest question, how does the wiki get updated? I'm currently in the process of trying to develop rules about when and how it gets updated to work with the senior staff here at DDOT, because there are currently no hard and fast rules since people use it for different reasons. Teams who create their own spaces can do it on their own time, but things like the compendium, which are publicly accessible, need to be done more often. So, these are some of the questions that we're asking ourselves. How often do we update? To whom do the update rules apply? Getting people to prioritize updates, and how do we get buy-in from leadership to make these rules? Because I can't do those things on my own. And some pros and cons, challenges. As I've said a couple times, DDOT has no agency-wide set of rules about where and how to store information, and it requires kind of a staunch group of super users to promote the wiki. And in an agency like DDOT that has bridges and bike lanes and traffic safety, information management is not always on the front of people's minds, even if it would make their job easier. The pros, the wiki can kind of cover the gaps in what I'm doing here in the library to make sure all kinds of different knowledge and information are documented. And as I said, it's really easy to use. Once people know what they're doing, there's usually no problem. Cons, the cost, but the bigger con is recently, because the wiki holds both internal and public information, which you can set in the permissions. We have had some security issues recently that have caused some trouble. So some pages that were public are no longer public, and we may be switching over to a new version of Confluence to kind of fix that problem. Looking forward, we're looking at implementing employee exit interviews to document in the wiki. And as I said, we may be moving to a different version of the wiki. And there's a push for better knowledge management at DDOT. kind of based on instituting rules and regulations for how and when to update, and creating 101 trainings for people to learn about knowledge and information management generally. And I think that's everything. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Katie. We do have a question. If the panelists can come back, that would be great. I have to put my glasses on. We do have, first question is for Francis. Common interests were apparently arrived by reviewing the searchable and accessible information. Is there any feedback or advice to the community in terms of viable practices or standard processes of collecting, documenting, reporting, and publishing the information in such a way to make it more accessible by large communities? That was a long, so get it? I can say it again.
I think as the way I understand the question is that for this project, we did rely on published documents, so the results are only as good as what was out there. Although we did do that validation, human review and people recalling other things that were important. But I think what your question is a much bigger question that wasn't addressed in the research that I think all of us in the information and knowledge management community are kind of working on, which is, how do we get better at identifying what's important to publish and make accessible and organize it in a way that can be found. And that's a subject of many prior research projects and ongoing research in information architecture and other things that I don't think we have time to address at this stage, but I think is certainly one of our committee's goals, is to try to help everyone get better at that.
Okay. Any other questions out there? While I'm waiting to see if another question pops up, I want to thank all 4 presenters and also Victoria Beal, who helped us facilitate this webinar from Ohio. And be aware that TRB is not the only knowledge management group out there. AASHTO also has a committee, and of course, in the broader context of the universe, knowledge management and information management touches us every day. So there's lots of ways to get involved. No more questions. Victoria, did you have any final comments? I do encourage people to download the presentations. If you click on the PDF, it brings up another window, and then you can download all the presentations.
Yeah, I just want to add that if anyone has an issue downloading the presentations, we will be sending a follow-up email with, at minimum, a link to the presentation files. Hopefully, if the webinar recording works, we'll also have a link to the webinar recording on our YouTube site. So you can rewatch it and listen to portions, because there was so much good information that was shared today. I feel like I've been drinking from the fire hydrant. So thank you, everyone.
And Francis, we also have a website at the TRB Knowledge and Information Management Committee as well, that has a lot of information. So
as does AASHTO Committee on Knowledge Management, and there's a LibGuide on knowledge management. So there's a lot of resources out there.
fantastic. Well, I want to thank everybody. Technology worked today. We had about 50 people join us. We had 70 sign up, and about 50 over the course of the event showed up, plus or minus. So that's good. That's good. It's good for a hot August summer day at the end of summer.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your time today, and we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Take care.
Thank you, Victoria.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.